Whether you do this with me, or you do this independently, or you do this with someone else, this is what I see to be your best path forward. And to me, that's agnostic of So Jonathan, we've been with Epic Insurance Brokers for going on 3.5 years, working on 12 to 13 years in the insurance industry. So that's 9 years of underwriting, which is kind of just like a mortgage underwriter might assess a risk. What an underwriter does is look at the risks based on an individual business and then assesses the price and coverage terms that they're willing to offer. So I did that for 9 years, and now working on the other side as kind of business advisory, risk management consulting, helping folks ensure their companies protect their assets and their people.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
So what I do is work as a commercial insurance broker, specializing in placing insurance risk, providing risk management consulting for real estate firms, asset managers, portfolio companies, general partners, limited partners, and family offices. And also working with nonprofits and education providers, being schools, independent schools, charter schools, and also nonprofits that provide social services to the community. So at the end of the day, we're all about servicing, whether it be providing spaces for people to cohabitate, to live, to enjoy themselves, providing a space within the community for kids to get educated and create a better future for themselves and their families.
Can you discuss some of the different kinds of insurances and their use cases?
Of course, yeah. I mean, just to make it really simple, right? You've got in property and casualty, which is what I do, you've got two kind of real elements, first party and third party. First party being a worker or an employee that might get injured on the job. You have an example of something like a fire that might happen at a property causing damage. And then on the other side, you might have a third party lawsuit, which is involving a third party that's gonna, bring a suit against you, alleging some kind of damage, whether that be mental anguish, bodily injury, you hurt their reputation. Those are kind of the two sides of the house. And so what we're really focused on is providing kind of an overall insurance review to make sure that all of those different elements of risk within an individual company are going to be taken care of.
In terms of what you do specifically, can you tell us about your position, role, and some of your day-to-day?
Yeah, so within the company, I'd be considered a principal producer. And our main role is really being kind of the quarterback and the leader in terms of driving the process for the insured, managing the services that kind of go along with the day-to-day implications of an insurance risk management program. I mean, making sure that they get all the necessary resources to the company that allow them to operate profitably and protect their assets. And so that could mean going out and looking for new pricing on their current insurance portfolio. It could mean providing risk control services and going to a school or going to an apartment building and, taking a look at the risers and saying, hey, what you're doing right now, this is great, but, there's probably a safer way to do this. So really, there's all these different facets, and being kind of the producer within Epic, your job is to make sure that you have all the right resources to be able to provide to them so that they can best protect their business.
How do you stay current and up to date with all the latest industry trends and insurance packages?
The insurance industry, like anything else, is always changing. It's adapting. And obviously with AI and you got wars and, you got geopolitical issues, you have a lot of things that kind of impact what carriers are willing to provide in terms of coverage, insurance kind of overall pricing and rate, right? And so what you can do, and typically what I do, is not just kind of like read through insurance journals and really make sure that I've got the literature side of things, but I also really try to focus on my relationships with my individual underwriters and insurance carriers, right? Because they're kind of the first line of defense, because as soon as stuff changes and there are large drastic changes across the industry, they're going to be the ones who are first implementing that across their underwriting guidelines. I mean, coming from a background of 9 years of underwriting, not only do I understand kind of the rating guidelines, their coverage terms, but I'm also able to have those relationships and talk with them about what's going on in the background, right? What are some of these things that are driving some of the changes at their individual companies? And how is that going to impact my clients, my prospective clients, not just now, but in the near future?
What are your reasons for wanting to work in the insurance industry or at Epic?
That's a good question. I think whenever I'm talking to, a random person on the bus, or I go down to the lunchroom, right, someone will say, what do you do, right? And when you tell them insurance, their face either glazes over or they think you work for a green gecko or a caveman, right? What I've always really found enjoyable about insurance, and which was impressed upon me at a young age, is that service and kind of the legacy we provide to our communities and the people around us is what matters most. And being in insurance, you kind of get to deal with community organizations and be a part of companies and make sure that what they're doing can be perpetuated. And to me, being able to be that backstop and have people's backs at some of their lowest moments has always kind of been what drove me to keep that kind of orientation towards service.
How do you assess and manage risk when recommending insurance products to clients?
That's a good question. And the way I try to think about it is less so about selling or pushing products on people. But first and foremost, I come from a business advisory perspective, where what I generally believe I bring to the table is that I sit on a charter school board. I sit on a board for a private school, and my dad and I invest in multifamily apartments across the country. And so I think whenever I'm approaching, whether it be asset managers, on the real estate side or executive directors in schools, I think what I kind of bring is this holistic approach that says, hey, I'll ask them, where are you at in business terms? What are some issues you've had and kind of where do you want to go? And I think by starting up here and tying this to the really nuts and bolts of kind of how insurance works and how it should work for them based on their operations, I believe by doing that, you get what I kind of call a 360 review of the organization so that at every level, vulnerabilities can be entirely covered. And that's vulnerabilities that may pop up now and vulnerabilities that may pop up in 6 months to a year that they weren't potentially contemplating.
How do you handle policy renewals and reviews with your clients?
What we really like to do on renewals, particularly given the changing environment for our clients, this is a serious item and it's a big cost for most of our clients because in some cases it can really make or break the profitability of a company or an individual asset, right? And so what we want to do is sit down early on in the process, and not only are we having, quarterly meetings just to touch base and talk about what's going on with the company, but we're also going to 90 days, 120 days out, what we're going to do is sit down and talk about, this year, this is kind of what we're anticipating based on the market. And what we want to do is give them a preparation for what's to come. And while we're having that kind of review with them, that may be 90 or 120 days out, simultaneously, what we're doing is having a conversation with their insurance carriers. And we're telling them, hey, we're seeing this in the industry. We're seeing this, these are kind of the trends. What are you anticipating for this individual client? And so as we have these two conversations simultaneously, what we're able to do is really get a perspective of what is potentially going to happen this year. What are both sides saying? And then how do we come to some place in the middle that really meets both of their expectations and allows for a compromise that's going to provide, our client the best coverage and the best price, regardless of what the market conditions are at that time.
What are your thoughts on compensation, providing value, and maintaining relationships?
When it comes to compensation, I think it's an interesting question. I think a lot of agents, brokers, agnostic of kind of the industry struggle with that, right? I mean, what I've always tried to impress upon my team members and other colleagues is that it's not, at the end of the day, compensation will come. And I firmly believe that if you do something you love and you provide value to those around you, that inevitably you'll be compensated for that work. So I think coming from a place of whether you do this with me or you do this independently or you do this with someone else, this is what I see to be your best path forward. And to me, that's agnostic of compensation. I'm still rather youthful in the industry. I believe I'm the youngest principal producer on the West Coast for Epic, and I don't see things changing in terms of relationships. And so I need to make sure that my relationships I'm in it for the long run. These are going to be 20, 30-year relationships with my clients, with my colleagues, with our stakeholders. And I intend to make sure that my reputation is strong and I'm known as someone who's always going to watch out for the best interest of those around me.
Can you give an example of how you've upsold or cross-sold insurance products?
Being in property and casualty, what we get to do is inherently kind of go through the operational elements of a company and work with a CFO and work with the head of operations, work with an asset manager. But there's also this other end, right, of not just protecting the assets and people on aggregate and the organization, but also worrying about the individual health and well-being of employees of the company. And so one thing that Epic does especially well is provide very robust, thoughtful, and creative programs around health benefits, dental, vision. And what I'll do is kind of go to the HR director for an organization that we work with and explain to them kind of the value that we're providing to other companies, some of the different type of wellness programs that we can provide, the service model that we generally present, and then connect the two parties. And what I'll do is bring in a colleague from Epic who specializes in health and benefits, and we'll sit down and we'll talk about what Epic does on both ends and understand how they're currently protecting their employees and providing healthcare benefits to them. And then we'll see if there's anything Epic can do to supplement that or make it better.
Can you share a recent success story of how your agency helped a client through a difficult claim process?
Without getting into too much detail, when you're working with schools, situations can get sensitive very quickly because you're dealing with communities, you're dealing with parents, you're dealing with family, and ultimately you're dealing with kids. And so, as I sit on two school boards, providing youth opportunities to improve their life, it's important to me. I think a really good example of this is, recently, within the past year, we had an opportunity to help out a school in my community where I grew up, where my parents grew up, where my siblings grew up. And, they had an incident that involved, an active assailant. And unfortunately, the prior team that was put in place, the broker before, it just wasn't used to working with schools. They didn't understand how coverage worked. They didn't understand kind of the cadence of working with carriers. And there was a gap there in what the school was able to get reimbursed based on the services they provide their students. And so, after the incident, they provided psychological help. They brought in mental wellness dollars. They had extra security. They had to move students. They lost their ADA over that time period, right? And so what we did is come in and we provided a claims counsel. And we also provided our top-notch claims adjuster who was able to work with the carrier who was denying coverage. And ultimately, we're able to show them and prove that not only did this loss occur, but they needed to honor their individual rider within that policy and they needed to reimburse the school. And so I think within that moment, given how important it is to protect students and for school to be fairly compensated so they can pour this money back in the community, it felt really, really good to get, $50,000, almost $100,000 back into a school's pocket so that they can, reutilize those dollars to care for their students.
What strategies do you use to generate new leads and sales?
This is something I know it's on every agent's mind, it's on every broker's mind. And luckily I've been really, really blessed with a strong network of centers of influence, friends, family who are all top notch in what they do. And typically what I've done is try to build networks and join associations of groups that I know are providing a lot of value to their communities and operating at a really high level. And so I think one of my main strategies is joining associations and making myself visible in the community so that, folks are running businesses and folks that are working high level in businesses and who need good advisors, trusted advisors, just making myself known. And I think when the opportunity arises, really raising my hand and saying, hey, I'm happy to help. I'm happy to be a resource on whatever you need. And, as the relationship grows, I think that's where you're able to provide more and more value until you kind of become their guy. And luckily, as things have grown, I've really become the go-to person for a lot of organizations I deeply care about, I'm passionate about. And through that, they've been great referral resources. And outside of just that, just working the network, I really do spend a lot of time, understanding the individual niches and industries that I work in and kind of seeing who's next. Who's doing what? Is someone expanding? Or did someone just raise a fund? And I think by staying on top of industry trends like that, you're able to connect with people at the right periods of time to where you're a necessary resource. Because stepping into spaces where people are already well entrenched, there's a lot of competitors, they've been working with someone 30, 40 years. That's going to be a tough place for you to fit in regardless of how skilled you are. But if you can catch people at the right time in the trajectory of their business, I think you can be a lot more successful with getting in there and providing value and then being their person kind of in the long run.
Can you explain the typical client profile that your agency serves and how you tailor your insurance products to meet their needs?
On the education side, we have a pretty broad-based appetite, and making sure that the school wants to work with us, has a need to work with a broker that's going to provide robust services, really think about their overall health from a risk management standpoint, and not just go out and find a quote. Nothing more a risk advisor kind of hates is hearing someone that's just, we're looking for a quote, right? Or we're going to do an RFP and we want someone to participate. Or we're going to do a market selection, which is a whole different process. And typically with prospects like that or folks interested, we typically stay away from that process as we want to come in and really understand your business and be a trusted partner. And so on both sides of the house, what we're really looking at is middle market type of clients up to institutional level, national and international clients. And I think that there are a lot of folks that specialize in small startups and in smaller businesses. I just think that when you're playing in the middle market space, you have to have a service, and at the national space, you have to have a service model that fits those clients' needs. And I think at Epic is what we really done is built a ton of resources and a lot of bench strength to be able to provide all the value that these companies need and kind of be a one-stop shop, right? A stop that can be nimble, forward-looking, and have everything you need. And so, I would say that on the real estate side, we really try to focus on groups that are well established and our groups that are growing very, very quickly. And the same with schools. And we certainly will help startups as schools are important to me, and I recognize the community necessity of them. We're certainly help schools nuts to bolts and help them grow. But what we're really meant to focus on, and I think where our skill set and my skill set really shines, is providing advisory services to larger organizations that have national footprints, large regional footprints, and are looking to grow and or stabilize themselves.
How does Epic as an agency support the ongoing education and training of its insurance agents?
I've always found Epic to be extremely supportive in terms of making sure that I was learning and making sure that everyone around me kind of had the resources and opportunity to upskill themselves. Because we really are in such a dynamic and fast changing time that if you're not thinking 5 years ahead and you're not thinking about skills that are going to be necessary in the next 20 years, then you're operating from a deficit, right? And so what Epic does really well is that not only do they have internal resources and internal platforms that you can access for free, that have a lot of these modern day insurance skills as free modules, right? To walk you through it in free classes. But Epic is also extremely supportive about making sure that their agents, have the means to go out and go to third party and go to conferences and sign up for special certificate programs and, giving money towards, masters of business programs. And I think that by, giving the people the space to learn internally, but also, supporting their growth externally is kind of what sets Epic apart and provides that kind of holistic approach to the organization and also the employees.
What are the most significant challenges facing your agency right now, and how do you contribute to overcoming them?
From an industry standpoint, you really have catastrophe risk and kind of the changing environment around, what's insurable, how large the severity is going to be, and, is there someone to insure it at a price that makes sense? And then you have kind of the changing, adapting workplace around generative AI, machine learning, and workflow. And so what we typically try to do is at least, in my own team and in our region, what we're really focusing on is understanding how workflows need to change based on the expectations of our clients. And then externally, kind of how do we then communicate and provide service to our stakeholders on our external platform? Because what we want to do is really be up there with the best of the best. And I always tell the team that the goal is to really operate like a Goldman Sachs or like a Lazard's, and that we want to, or a Vista Equities, to support African American brothers, that we want to be the best of the best in the financial services industry, agnostic of insurance, agnostic of technology. We want to be a best-in-class financial industry and a best in financial class team. And so I think that's how we try to handle things from the technological standpoint. And then I think from an external standpoint, what we try to do and what I think Epic is very successful at is really looking at the carrier partners and how the industry is changing and thinking about creating very bespoke products, whether it be, RPGs or new versions of captives or new syndicates within Lloyd's of London, and saying like, all right, like this is stuff that's coming in to fill in very critical gaps in the market. And how do we get there first and respond and create something that's unique to be able to deliver, our clients something that's differentiated.
Can you discuss in more detail any sub-niches of the insurance industry we should be more aware of, such as for the real estate sector or in terms of insurance for education providers?
Going into real estate specifically, I think it's a very interesting and topical class right now, because all the way across the country, right, you're seeing housing shortages, and you're seeing, people relocate and organizations rethink how they think about creating spaces for people to live. And being within California, there's no shortage of folks that are looking to fill that gap. But from a regulatory perspective, the environment is still challenging, right? And so one of the reasons why real estate can be particularly challenging from risk management and liability side within California is that we have a dearth of personal injury attorneys who are, out there and ready and willing to, sue an investor, sue a property owner, regardless of whether there's any merit to an individual lawsuit. And that's not saying there's not certainly instances all the time, landlords and property managers who aren't doing things correctly. But within Los Angeles, San Francisco, I think some areas of San Diego, you have what's really kind of a judicial hellhole, right? And so that's making things very tough. And what we really like to do is stay on top of the different type of risk control practices that are out there to be able to mitigate some of these risks, before they happen. And then when they do happen, there are claims for our clients, we can come back and help them fix their protocols so that they have less of these, right? And so one thing that kind of comes up is habitability. And on the real estate side is individual tenants claiming that their unit is not habitable because of mold, because of how it's kept by the owner. Ultimately, these become pretty serious class action suits that even if you settle and there's no merit, so you're probably looking at $11,000 to $15,000 just to settle on an individual unit basis for class actions. And so if you have 10, you got 20, you got 30 people that are participating in class action, what you have is almost $300,000 in individual settlements alone. And so that number can be crippling, particularly for smaller, mid-sized investors and owners. And on top of that kind of social liability element, you also have just a greater probability that nowadays we have more weather, we have more severe weather, right? And this is all impacting older residential apartments, which an investor might buy because they see it as a value add proposition, where they can come into a 1950s, 1960s, 1970s type of asset and provide some value and raise the rents. But what you see across a lot of urban areas across the country is that there's caps, and there's a lot of social pressure to cap increases in rent, while subsequently you have insurance costs and operating costs which are going up. So we're beginning to see this disparity, right? And insurance is a large line item within the operating budget for an individual asset and for individual investors across the country. And what we do is like to step in and show them what's the most efficient way for them to insure that risk and protect the asset from the long run. And whether that be capital expenditures that may improve the outlook for carriers, and that could be electrical breakers, that could be updating the roof, that could be adding a fence to a pool. It could be adding newer steps. It could be adding rails along steps. It could be renovating the property for earthquake. It's all really on an individual case-by-case basis, kind of based on the investor, based on the lender, and based on the owner's risk appetite. And not to mention, the question you had asked about schools is a good one, particularly within California. What we're tending to see is that there are more lawsuits around discrimination, around wrongful termination, around wage and hour for schools. And carriers are beginning to see this, and what they're doing is pulling out of the market. And so without those coverages in place or very, very high deductibles, and you have a lot of these frequency type of issues, I mean, if you got 10 in a year and your deductible is 100,000 or 50,000, which is very normal employment practices deductible, you may be in the space where you're paying $500,000, over a very short time span because of claims that are really uninsurable. And so what we want to do is establish a relationship with the school very quickly to talk about the best practices around hiring, firing, termination, end of year reviews, right? And so by doing this, we can help them avoid any space where a employee may, wrongfully allege that a school terminated them without cause, had discriminated against, or is doing it because they're a whistleblower. And that's not to minimize that these instances do actually happen. It's really just to put the onus on the judicial environment, judges, and making sure that, people who are wronged are compensated, but also making sure that schools that do the right things are protected and aren't facing that kind of liability. And that's not to mention the new threats you have out there from cyber. Because these schools are sitting on vast amounts of data from different students, and these are students without credit cards. So their profiles are highly valuable to individuals who may come in through a phishing attack, through a Trojan horse, through a ransomware. And so by getting that data, it's highly covetable in places like Eastern Europe. And so selling this data to third parties is very profitable. So our schools, which don't necessarily have the ability to have super complex encryption or MFA, and they don't have the money to necessarily put the money into technology year over year. They're kind of the main targets for a lot of this. And frankly, for a lot of education providers, it's kind of on the back burner because it's extra cost. And that's, that doesn't even take into account what's called sexual abuse and molestation, which within California, because some of recent legislation, which has pushed back the time frame with which a lawsuit could be brought, you have a span of like 40 to 50 years here where someone from the past can come back to a school, and allege and bring suit based on an incident that had happened 40 or 50 years ago. That's regardless of whether that employee is still around, whether the leadership has changed, whether the organization is different. And that provides a lot of exposure for organization. And so you have kind of all these different confounding social elements all kind of happening at once, right? You've got individuals that are more inclined to go into schools and struggling with their mental health. And, it can be a hyper dangerous environment, and what we like to do is be a resource for schools and really communicate to them and support them so that they know that it's not, if, but when something happens, they have someone there to be their advocate and make sure they have all the right coverages in place.
Thank you, Jonathan. This Beyond Insurance conversation has been beyond insightful.
Beyond Insurance, insurance that covers you beyond your needs.